Thank you. Thanks very much. And I will say that Jessup is a name I married into. My family name is Dolan, so I've got a good Irish pedigree from County Cavan. So here's my story, The Fiddler and the Faeries. A fiddler was walking home from the pub one night. He had been playing for his friends and the whole evening, and he'd earned a pint or two for his labor. His path home took him by a hill, which was secretly a fairy mound. And as he drew close, he began to get very tired, so sleepy he couldn't keep his eyes open, and he found he was stumbling. And he thought, well, now I'm in no shape to go home. So he thought that he would just pull off the path where there was this wee patch of grass, and he'd have a little nap. And sure, when he woke up, he'd have lots of energy to go on home. And that's what he did. But no sooner did the fiddler close his eyes than he began to hear whispering in his ear. He opened his eyes and he looked up, and there was a fairy leaning over him, a beautiful fairy. And oh, she talked so sweetly. She said he was the finest fiddler in the entire county, maybe even in all of Ireland. And he must come back to the mound on New Year's Eve and play for the fairy gathering. Well, the fiddler protested that he couldn't possibly do that because it was a tradition that he always played in the village pub on New Year's Eve, played for everyone, and he just couldn't break that tradition. But that fairy kept on, and she had a silver tongue. And before long, he found himself promising that he would come back to the fairy mound on New Year's Eve. And the minute that promise left his lips, she disappeared. Well, as the fiddler's walking home, he thought, did I dream that whole thing? Because, sometimes when I'm in the drink, I do have some pretty interesting dreams. But no, he knew in his bones that he had met a fairy. And what's more, he knew that if you made a promise to a fairy, you better keep your word, because they can hand out bad luck just as well as good. But the fiddler decided that he would not tell anyone about what had happened. Because if people didn't believe in fairies, well, then they'd tease him. And most people who did believe in fairies, well, then they'd be pestering him with questions and wanting more details, and they'd want to come back with him. And he just wasn't so sure about it all yet. So he thought, no, he would just keep it to himself. Well, the months rolled by, and it was New Year's Eve. And wouldn't you know, he had just eaten something that didn't agree with him. Oh, his stomach was roiling in turmoil. He couldn't possibly play at the pub. And his friends were disappointed, but they understood, and they went off to celebrate without him. And the fiddler grabbed his fiddle and bow, and he hit for the fairy mound. He remembered the fairy's instructions. There was a big stone at the bottom, and he rapped 3 times firmly on it and waited. And then he heard a loud crack and a creak, and he looked up, and he could see a slit in the hillside that was starting to open. And it opened and opened and opened until it was wide enough to be a doorway. Taking a deep breath, the fiddler stepped inside, and he found himself in a huge cave that was brilliantly lit, must have been 1,000 candles. And that cave was full of fairies, beautiful fairies, every size and shape, young and old. Oh, and they wore these dresses that were sort of a opalescent gauze, and they caught the light and shimmered almost like they had diamonds in them. Oh, they were beautiful. His eyes scanned the room, and he spotted the fairy that he had seen on the path. She smiled at him and nodded, and he knew what to do. He picked up his fiddle and bow, and he began to play. Well, I'll tell you, he had never played before like he played that night. It was something to see. His fingers flew over the frets, never making a mistake, never getting tired. He played song after song, songs he knew, songs he didn't even know that he knew. And the fairies, oh, how they danced. They whirled and twirled, catching the light. They were brilliant. And at times they seemed to just lift right off the floor and just hover there. Oh, they were beautiful. Well, the fiddler could not have told you how long he played, because truly time didn't seem to matter. But at some point, he caught the fairy looking at him again, and she nodded, and he knew it was time. So he put down his fiddle and bow, and she walked over and quickly bent down, and she scooped up a handful of dirt off the floor of the cave, and she poured it into his palm and closed his fingers over it. And then she guided him. She didn't touch him, mind, but he just felt himself being propelled back to that doorway and then outside. And as soon as he was outside under the moonlight and the cold air, he heard a click, and he whirled around and looked. and the crack in the hillside was gone. You would never have known it had been there. There was no sign of it. The hill looked as before. He opened his fingers, and there was a pile of gold coins. Not fairy gold, mind, real gold coins. Well, the fiddler's walking home that night, and he makes a decision. He's not going to tell anyone what has happened. Because what could come of that? They'd be pestering him for the gold, and he'd have to share it, and oh, there'd be no end of the torment. No, he'd keep it to himself. But over the coming months, he spent that gold very slowly and carefully and subtly, a little bit here and there, never making a splash. But he did things like repaired the thatch on his cottage and gave it a whitewash. And he fixed some of the stone and wood fencing that he had, and a new wheel for the cart. But it wasn't just what he could buy. His luck in general improved. His crops grew so tall that year. He'd never seen the like of it. And his flock, all those healthy babies. And his own children, not one day of sickness. He was a fortunate man indeed. As the months went by and midsummer came again, well, he was happy to see that fairy back on the path one night. And he didn't take much convincing. Yes, he promised he would return and play for them on New Year's Eve. And she was gone. Well, the months go by and it's New Year's Eve. And wouldn't you know, he's got some terrible virus. Oh, he's ill with the chills. It's just awful. And he's aching all over, and there's no way he can play music. Well, once again, his friends go off without him. And he picks up his fiddle and bow back to the fairy mound. Everything happened just as before. The rock was there. He knocked on it. He was let inside. He played for the fairies. They danced. And when it was all over, he was standing outside the cave with a handful of gold coins. Now, this continued for several years. And over time, no matter how carefully he spent that money, things visibly improved for the fiddler and his family and his homestead. And his neighbors couldn't help but notice. How is it that your crops go so fine and mine are just on the other side of the wall and they're doing so poorly? And where did you get the money for that new cart and a horse? And your family, new clothes, look at that. So people began to wonder, and they would pester the fiddler. They would say, how can you afford this? How can you afford it? And of course, he always had an excuse or two ready. He would say, well, maybe if you didn't go off to the pub every night, if you saved a coin or two, then you would be able to afford a new cart as well. Or he might say, well, I've got this auntie in Dublin and I was kind of her favorite. And well, she passed away, and didn't she leave me with a wee bit of money, and I've used it very wisely. But as things went on year after year, people began to wonder, how many old aunties in Dublin could you have? And, where there was no logical explanation, their minds began to imagine. And even if they pestered the fiddler, he was no help. He would say, they would say, oh, maybe the fairies, maybe that's it. Oh, you're mixed up with the fairies. Everybody knows the fairies. If they take a shine to you, oh, there's no end to your good fortune. And he would just say, go on, don't be silly, don't be daft. But they did wonder. Now, about this time, a new priest came to the parish. And, like a lot of new priests, he brought a soapbox with him. He had a favorite topic that he liked to sermonize about. And this priest talked about and against the fairies. He said there was no such thing about fairies. He was adamant you were not to believe in them. Worse, he said, that was superstition. And superstition was the devil's playground. And if you believed in fairies, then you were with the devil. And there would be none of that. You could not set foot in his church if you believed in the fairies. Well, over time, with him sermonizing and ranting, well, the folks, they began to suppress their belief in the fairies. And eventually they turned away from the fairies altogether. And they turned away from the fiddler because they said, if it's not fairy luck that brought him this wealth, then where is he getting his money? They didn't believe him. And of course, he couldn't explain. And so they began to say, you're a thief. It's clear you've stolen that money. Now, who have you taken it from? Tell us the truth. And they raged and ranted at him. And eventually, they would have nothing to do with him. They shun him. And it was a long, lonely road he walked. Well, that year, he could hardly wait for midsummer to come because he was so lonely. And he knew that at least the fairies loved his music and they would spend time with him. But that year, Midsummer came and went, and there was no fairy on the path. And he thought, well, that's odd. He began to walk every day and several times a day. Maybe I'm just missing her. No fairy. And it got close to New Year's Eve, and he thought to himself, well, every year they invite me. Every year I say yes. So maybe it's just understood. Maybe it's like a new tradition. And so they don't feel they have to invite me. They know I'll come. That must be it. And so when New Year's Eve came, well, it wasn't like anyone else wanted to spend time with him. So he picked up his fiddle and bow and back to the mound he went. He knocked on that rock 3 times, but nothing happened. He knocked again and again, rap, rap, rap. And he waited and he looked, and he heard a little click and a bit of a creak. And there was a slit appearing in the hillside, but it didn't open wide and wide and wide like before. No, just a bit, maybe enough he could squeeze through. He walked up to that crack and worked his way in, and he was standing in the cave in the darkness, pitch black, couldn't see a thing. But there was a little bit of light, moonlight coming through that crack, and in a couple of minutes his eyes adjusted, and he could make out the shape of the walls of the cave. And then over in the corner, it looked like a huddled figure, and he let out a gasp and he called, "Who is it at all?" And the head lifted up, and the eyes stared at him. And those eyes, he would have known them anywhere. It was the eyes of the fairy he'd met so many times. But she didn't look the same. She was no longer beautiful. She looked like an old hag. Her hair was stringy and greasy, big circles under her eyes and deep wrinkles, bent over like a crone, and her clothes all ragged and grimy. He went over to her and he said, "What has happened? Where are the fairies?" And she said, they flit away. They flit away. But where?" said the fiddler. "Are they coming back?" She shook her head sadly. "No," she said. Fairies won't stay where folks don't believe in them. They won't stay where they're not wanted. And so they flit away to another place, and they won't be back. But you, I know you still believed, and I knew you'd come back. So I've returned tonight to say goodbye." She leaned over and slowly picked up a handful of dirt off the cave floor, and she poured it into his hands, and she closed his fingers over it and held on for just a second. And when she let go, she faded away. The fiddler turned and he stumbled towards that crack to that little bit of moonlight, and he squeezed through and he was outside with a handful of gold coins. But then he realized that he hadn't heard the click. So he whirled around and he looked, and the hillside had not closed. The crack was still there. Well, you may wonder about that. And if you were to go to County Clare today and find that hill, you would see the crack still in the side of it. Wonder you may. But there's a very simple explanation for it. Because really, there's no need to hide a fairy entrance if you don't believe in fairies, is there?